There's a moment near the end of Metal Gear Solid 4 where Big Boss, old and dying, stands in front of the boss's grave and says something that basically rewrites everything you thought you understood about him. He says he finally understands what she wanted, and it only took him decades of war, the creation of multiple armed nations, the corruption of his own ideals, and the near destruction of civilization to get there. That's Big Boss in a nutshell. A man who spent his entire life chasing the meaning of a single moment he never actually understood. And I think that makes him one of the most psychologically honest characters in fiction. Not because he's right, but because the way he breaks, the way he rebuilds himself into something dangerous and wrong while being completely convinced he's honoring a dead woman's legacy, that's so deeply human, it's almost uncomfortable. So let's talk about him, not as a list of cool moments or a Laurie recap, but as a person. What does he actually want? What broke him? And why does a man who rejects nations end up building one? Let's start where it actually starts, which is not Outer Heaven, not Zanzibar land, not any of the stuff Big Boss is famous for. It starts in a forest in Russia in 1964 with a woman he loved like a mother pointing a gun at him. Before Operation Snake Eater, the man who would become Big Boss was just Jack, Naked Snake. And what's interesting about Snake Eater is how ordinary he is at the beginning of that story. Not ordinary in skill, obviously the guy is eating snakes and throwing people off cliffs, but ordinary in belief. He's a soldier, he believes in his mission, he believes in his country, he trusts his commanding officers, he trusts the boss. His worldview is clean and functional. There's a hierarchy, there's a purpose, and he fits inside it. The mission makes sense, the chain of command makes sense, America makes sense, and I think it's worth sitting with that for a second, because it tells you something important about what kind of person Jack was before everything fell apart. He wasn't some brooding revolutionary, he wasn't born skeptical of power, he was a true believer. In the language of psychology, his identity was what Erik Erikson would call foreclosed, meaning he inherited a set of values and a role from the people above him, primarily the boss, and he never really questioned it. He didn't need to, it worked. She was the greatest soldier alive, she was his mentor, she gave him a framework for understanding the world, and he accepted it completely. That's important, because when your identity is built on somebody else's foundation, and that foundation gets ripped out, you don't just lose a belief, you lose yourself. And that's exactly what happens on that bridge. The boss defects, or at least that's what it looks like. And then slowly over the course of the mission, the truth reveals itself in the worst possible way. She didn't defect. She was ordered to pretend to defect so America could run an intelligence operation, and she was always meant to die at the end of it. The mission was never to stop her. The mission was to kill her in a way that looked righteous so the government could get what it wanted and maintain plausible deniability. She knew this, she accepted it, and she let her own student, the person she raised, be the one to pull the trigger. Now here's where I think most analyses of Big Boss get a little shallow. People focus on the betrayal by the government, and yeah, that matters, we'll get there. But the deeper wound isn't political, it's personal, it's relational. The person he trusted most in the world set him up to destroy her, and she did it willingly, and she did it in the name of a loyalty to country that he is now supposed to admire. There's a concept in modern psychology called moral injury. It's different from PTSD. PTSD is about fear and threat. Moral injury is about meaning. It happens when someone experiences a profound violation of their moral framework, especially when that violation is caused or sanctioned by an institution they trusted. It was first studied in veterans, and the symptoms are exactly what you see in Big Boss after Snake Eater. Rage that doesn't have a clean target. Grief that can't resolve because the loss doesn't make sense inside any moral system he has access to. And most importantly, a total collapse of trust in the structures that were supposed to give life meaning. He kills the boss, he gets a medal, the president shakes his hand, and he feels nothing but disgust. Not because the government betrayed him, though it did, but because the government revealed what it actually is. A machine that uses people and calls it patriotism. He looked behind the curtain and saw that loyalty flows upward but never downward. The boss gave everything and the country she served couldn't even let her be remembered honestly. That's the fracture. That's where Jack dies and Big Boss begins. But here's the thing about fractures. They don't just destroy, they also create. When your old worldview collapses, you have to build a new one, and the new one is always shaped by the specific way the old one broke. Big Boss doesn't come out of Snake Eater as a nihilist, he doesn't stop believing in things. He stops believing in one specific thing, which is the legitimacy of nations to command the loyalty of soldiers. And this is where it gets philosophically interesting. There's a concept from Max Weber, the sociologist, that I think maps almost perfectly onto what Big Boss is reacting to. Weber argued that the modern state is defined by its monopoly on legitimate violence, meaning the state is the only entity that gets to decide when force is acceptable, who gets to use it, and what it's used for. Soldiers, police, intelligence operatives, they're all extensions of this monopoly. And the key word is legitimate. The state doesn't just use violence, it gets to call its violence justified while calling everyone else's violence criminal. Big Boss looked at this system and said no, not because he's against violence, obviously, but because he experienced firsthand what happens to the people inside that monopoly. They become tools. The boss was a tool. He was a tool. Every soldier who ever followed an order and got discarded afterward was a tool. The state takes your body, your skill, your willingness to die, it uses all of it, and then it defines your sacrifice however is politically convenient. The boss saved the world and got labeled a traitor because that's what the mission required. So what does Big Boss do with this realization? He tries to build a space outside the system. That's Militaires Sans Frontières. That's Outer Heaven. That's Zanzibar land. The names change, but the idea is consistent. A place where soldiers are not tools of a state, but people with agency. A nation of soldiers, for soldiers, answering to no government. And this is the central paradox that I think makes Big Boss genuinely tragic, and not just cool or badass, but actually tragic in the dramatic sense. He rejects the concept of the nation because the nation betrayed his mentor and used her as a disposable asset. But the thing he builds in response is a nation. It has borders, it has an army, it has a leader whose authority is essentially unquestioned, it has an ideology, it recruits, it fights wars. The only difference is that Big Boss tells himself it's different because the people there chose to be there. But did they? Or did they follow him because he's charismatic and powerful and gave them a sense of belonging in a world that threw them away? Because that's what every nation does. That's literally the mechanism. Benedict Anderson wrote this whole book called Imagine Communities about how nations aren't natural, they're constructed. There are stories people tell each other to create a sense of shared identity. And Big Boss, the man who saw through the story his own nation was telling, turns around and writes a new story and doesn't realize he's doing the same thing. This is where Nietzsche becomes almost unavoidable. There's a passage in Thus Spoke Zarathustra about the three metamorphoses. The spirit becomes a camel, carrying the weight of duty and tradition. Then the camel becomes a lion, roaring no against the old values, destroying the thou shalt. And then the lion is supposed to become a child, creating new values from a place of innocence and openness. Big Boss makes it to lion. He absolutely makes it to lion. The rejection of national loyalty, the refusal to be a camel carrying someone else's ideology, that's the lion's no. But he never becomes the child. He never creates something genuinely new. He takes the old system, the same hierarchy, the same structure of command and loyalty and sacrifice, and he rebuilds it with himself at the top. He doesn't escape the cycle. He restarts it with a different flag. And I think deep down, some part of him knows this. I think that's why he keeps going, keeps building, keeps escalating. Outer Heaven isn't enough, so it becomes Zanzibar land. One Metal Gear isn't enough. One army isn't enough. There's an almost compulsive quality to it, and if you look at it psychologically, it makes sense. He's trying to fill a void that can't be filled because the void isn't about soldiers or nations or geopolitics. The void is about a woman who died in a field of white flowers and a student who was never able to grieve her honestly. This is what Kojima understands so well about trauma. It doesn't make you wise. Sometimes it makes you driven and charismatic and powerful and completely wrong. Big Boss walks away from the boss's grave with a wound that he converts into a worldview, and that worldview lets him do extraordinary things, but it also lets him justify child soldiers, nuclear weapons, and endless proxy wars because it's all in service of the vision, and the vision is sacred because it was born from sacred pain. And that's the other thing about Big Boss that I think is brutally honest. He's not a monster who knows he's a monster. He's a guy who genuinely believes he's building something beautiful. Every cult leader, every revolutionary who becomes a dictator, every liberation movement that calcifies into an authoritarian regime, it starts with someone who has a legitimate grievance and a genuine vision and slowly loses the ability to distinguish between their personal pain and a universal truth. Big Boss saw a real problem. Soldiers are used and discarded by states. That's true. That's historically accurate and morally serious. But his solution to that problem was to make himself the one using and discarding them instead, and he couldn't see it because the wound that made him was so deep that it became his entire identity. He couldn't question Outer Heaven because Outer Heaven was the answer to the boss's death, and questioning it would mean her death had no meaning, and that was the one thing he could not survive. That's why the ending of Metal Gear Solid 4 hits so hard. When Big Boss finally stands at that grave and says he was wrong, that the boss's will wasn't about creating a world for soldiers, it was about putting down the gun. It was about loyalty not to a nation or an army, but to the world itself, to people, to the plain ordinary idea that life is worth more than any ideology. He got it backwards for 40 years. The boss didn't sacrifice herself because she believed soldiers deserved a nation. She sacrificed herself because she believed some things are bigger than soldiers, bigger than nations, bigger than the self. And Big Boss took that sacrifice and made it about himself, made it about his pain, built an empire on a misreading. And the tragedy is that by the time he understands this, he's dying. He gets maybe 10 minutes of clarity after a lifetime of being wrong. He holds the woman he destroyed a world over, not as a symbol, not as an ideology, just as a person he lost. And then he dies. There's a term in existentialist philosophy, bad faith. Sartre used it to describe the act of deceiving yourself about your own freedom, telling yourself you had no choice when you did, pretending your actions were determined by circumstances when really you were choosing every step of the way. Big Boss lived in bad faith for decades. He told himself he was honoring the boss. He told himself soldiers needed him. He told himself the world forced his hand. But he was choosing. Every army he built, every war he started, every line he crossed, he chose it. And he chose it because choosing it was easier than sitting with the grief of a flower field in Russia and admitting that he didn't know what any of it meant. That's what makes Big Boss one of the great tragic figures in storytelling. Not the betrayals, not the wars, not the clones or the giant robots. It's that he's a man of extraordinary capability and genuine moral conviction who gets one crucial thing wrong, and because he's so capable and so convicted, that one wrong thing cascades into decades of destruction. He's a nationalist without a nation because he understood that nations are constructs but couldn't accept that his alternative was also a construct. He saw through every lie except his own, and by the time he saw through that one too, it was too late to do anything but apologize to a gravestone and fall. I think about Big Boss a lot when I look at the real world, at people who see a genuine injustice and build an identity around opposing it and slowly become the thing they were fighting. It happens constantly. It happens in politics, in movements, in personal relationships. The wound becomes the worldview becomes the crusade, and the crusade becomes the cage. Kojima didn't just write a villain origin story. He wrote a map of how good people go wrong. And the scariest part is that the map makes sense at every step. You can follow Big Boss's logic from that bridge in Russia to the burning wreckage of Outer Heaven, and at no point does he make a decision that feels irrational in the moment. That's the horror of it. Not that he became a monster, but that the path to monstrosity was paved with understandable choices and real grief and a love that deserved better than what he did with it. That's Big Boss, a soldier who lost his mother, his country, and his purpose in the same moment, and spent the rest of his life building replacements for all three out of gunpowder and grief. A nationalist without a nation, a patriot of a country that exists only in his pain, and in the end, at the very end, a man who finally put down the gun. 40 years too late, but he put it down.